For those of you who might know the Skoll Center for Social Innovation at Said Business School, it's kind of based on the same principle. So it's part of the social innovation, is part of the core course of the MBA, so part of the kind of teaching curriculum of the school. But not only that, we're a center that researches innovation and pilots innovation in health, education, and finance. And one of those innovations is social impact bonds. We're a team of 2.5, so it's myself and an analyst, Barry, and then Ani Patton. She leads the finance initiative. She's working on a number of projects. She's kind of overseeing the work that we do. So, yeah, sometimes we feel a little bit overstretched, but we love it. I've got a few other speakers in the room who are going to be answering some questions a bit later. I'm not going to introduce them now. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves when we start on the Q&A session. Basically, I'm going to be telling you a narrative of how we've been working in South Africa to build the market. These guys have quite a depth of expertise, global awareness, and working in an international capacity in this field. So really, I want most of the session to be focused on what they have to say. So hopefully this will last for about 20 minutes, and then we can move on. Before I begin, if I could get a show of hands of who knows who's heard of an impact bond, and who knows how they work. Okay, so the majority, which is encouraging. So a year ago, I would have sat in a room and no one would have put their hand up, and then I would have spent 20 minutes on the first 5 slides. But I'm going to whip through kind of how the transaction works, the flow of money, and then hopefully that'll cover a few bases for people who are new to this. You start with an outcomes funder. That can be private sector, so a donor or government. They decide on a list of outcomes that they'd be willing to pay for, and they set up an outcomes-based contract with a service provider. In other words, it's a contract which means that the service provider will be paid once results are verified. There's a little bit of complication around who actually contracts with the outcomes funder. I don't want to go into details around that. It could potentially be the investor. It could be a special purpose vehicle. Basically what happens is that service provider will raise some sort of finance up front, mainly in the global north. There are over 50 that have been launched, as an academic institution to research, innovation, etc. But what about a Genesis or a Delberg or a social finance that needs to raise this funding to be able to continue doing these feasibilities and scoping studies? Well, first of all, I just want to say that there's no money coming from our government at the moment to do that. There'll be early conversations that are starting to be had. So in the States, for instance, I had a conversation with Drew yesterday about how their intermediaries are paying for the pre-contracting work. And they tend to be paid on a success basis. Say, for instance, you secure some outcomes funding, you conduct a feasibility, and there's an actual launch. Those intermediaries they'll be paid a fee for service from the investor in the deal, and then perhaps have some performance-linked piece to that payment. Ultimately, that payment is coming out of the outcome funder pot. So government ultimately ends up paying for that. In South Africa, I think we're a little bit away from that. We haven't launched a bond yet, but that is the direction that we'll be heading. Otherwise, there are more kind of generic platforms, international platforms that are available that people can raise funding to do feasibility. One of them being Convergence platform. We've applied to Prosperity Fund, which is a UK platform, for instance. So if you kind of keep an eye on the sector, you'll notice these opportunities coming up. All right. So what has been our approach? Essentially, what we're trying to do is unlock outcomes funding. Without outcomes funding, you don't have a deal. And so there are a few people, organizations that have come awry in developing very impressive feasibilities without necessarily having outcomes funding secured. So we are hoping in our position as this neutral position that that we can perhaps encourage government departments not only to start thinking about impact bonds, but to think a little bit wider around outcomes-based contracting more generally, which is when we frame a conversation with our government, that tends to be how we started. This is a form of outcomes-based contracting. It's how we finance an outcomes-based contract. And at the moment, our government is not necessarily doing any other work with regards to their service delivery or social service delivery in this particular area. So impact bonds have been quite a nice inroad in introducing outcomes-based contracting. The first step, especially with National Treasury, is looking at regulatory. First has been the Public Finance Management Act we've had to negotiate or navigate. One of the main elements that you might encounter, you've encountered, is how to budget for a future financial commitment. And so that's actually part of our act. So it's just a case of finding it and interpreting it. The second is, how do you, if a service provider overperforms in year one of a 3-year contract, or year 2 or year 3, is there an opportunity for them to advance payment from the second year? Or alternatively, if they underperform, is there an opportunity to roll over funding? Now that's quite a common thing in private partnerships with regards to infrastructure. In South Africa we do that. In other countries they do that with social services, but in South Africa we don't. We don't have a law which enables us to do that. We have an annual budget and you're really supposed to stick to it. So that's one of the things we've had to contend with. The other is quite South Africa specific, and that's with the broad-based Black economic empowerment. And you can find a little bit more of that information on the ring-bound booklets on the table. Our corporates are quite involved in corporate social investment, both from the investment side in terms of enterprise development and in terms of socio-economic development and skills development. So a certain portion of their profit after tax needs to go to non-profits and in fact to for-profits to basically develop the country. Thirdly, we've had to look at the structure of the SPV. So if you guys are looking into directing funding through a special purpose vehicle, or contracting through a special purpose vehicle, it needs to be set up in a way that's most tax effective for all your stakeholders. And again, there's some details in there. Okay, so we've been looking at regulation. In conjunction with that, we've been looking at designing a fund. Now, when we went to National Treasury initially, they said to us, well, we're happy to look through this structure, this theoretical structure that you're presenting to us. We're happy to feed back to you. But what we really want is we want to see a deal on the table that we can scrutinize, preferably a deal that's launched. And so we can start to better understand how it works, and we can see some of the pitfalls before we publish anything. As you can imagine, our provincial treasury, who's very compliance-driven, is very concerned about launching something that doesn't have sign-off from National Treasury. And so we've been kind of playing this chicken and egg game for the last year and a half. And what's actually happened, and it has not been planned, is that both of those elements, both the kind of regulatory element and the design element, have come together at the same time. So we've got this practice note sitting with Treasury, and we've got a bond that's about to launch, which is obviously quite lucky. And then the third element around building the market is around stakeholder education, as I've mentioned. Okay, those are some of the projects that we've been involved in. So we work, our government works in sort of 3 relatively autonomous levels. So you've got national, provincial, and municipal. They're governed by slightly different acts. And so we've been trying to engage with stakeholders at each of those levels. As I mentioned earlier, the early childhood development, that's been done at provincial level, and that's the furthest that we've got with a deal so far. And that's hopefully going to be launching 3 impact bonds within the next year. And the other quite interesting area is around workforce development with the City of Cape Town, and a feasibility that's going on at national level. That's with the Global Fund. Actually, social finance is intermediary on that deal. They're dealing with Global Fund and our National Health Department. They've been working very closely with us as well, guiding us through the design process, and also speaking to some of our officials. So those are various projects. I'm not going to go through all of them, but happy to talk about any of them afterwards if anyone's interested. Okay, so why early childhood development? Because it's really complex. It was a difficult place to start. And the reason was that after publishing a paper with National Treasury 3 years ago, the Western Cape Provincial Government came to us and said, we want you to look into impact bonds and we want you to look at ECD. So, that was obviously great that they asked us to look into that particular area. But sure, we certainly learned after a short time that there just lots of complications, stakeholders, etc. We've navigated most of those, hopefully. It has turned out, in retrospect, that it's quite an interesting, hopefully quite a powerful area to be working in. There's a lot of political will behind it. In fact, Pravin Gordhan, our latest finance minister, he announced a couple of days ago at the budget speech that we've got an extra 850 million rand that's gone into it, which is significant because everything else is being cut at the moment. And we've got a new policy that has been tabled this year, the start of this year, in fact accepted at the start of this year, and a new framework. So there's a lot of political will behind this project. It's also a really fragmented sector. So our province, for instance, is currently paying over 2,000 providers to serve the kids in the province. And this is an opportunity to catalyze a little bit of coordination between those sector players. At the moment, thirdly, we're getting really bad outcomes. And it's multifactorial. You can't just place a child in kindergarten after having 4 years of really being underserved in the system and expect them to excel. There's not enough money, there's not enough expertise out there. So we would like to start to really dive deeply into some models that are really effective in our context. And then also it really lends itself to joint funding. So at the beginning of this project, we were working with the Department of Social Development and Health. They both pay for children between the ages of 0 and 5, different elements of those children. We were really hoping that they could rationalize their services and start paying or run a joint procurement. And for 8 months into the design process, it looked like we were heading in that direction. And then the social development decided that they were going to back off from that they didn't necessarily want to hand over some of their funding to the Department of Health and vice versa. So that was a disappointment, but has actually proved a little bit administratively easier in the design going forward. So it's always something to aim for, joint funding. We just don't have a particularly well-established mechanism where departments can fund together. What has to happen is that one department has to give money to another department. They can't, for instance, pay for separate outcomes at the moment on the same contract, or at least it makes it incredibly complex. The other thing around joint funding is that, and I think that this applies in developing countries across the board, is that governments don't tend to pay for all services. A lot of services are paid for by donors, or in this case are paid for by parents. So NGOs, what's happening is that they're going out piecemeal, individually, to multiple donors on an annual basis, trying to raise funding to augment their provision. And so this gives an opportunity, hopefully, to combine funding in the Outcomes Fund to be able to distribute that funding more efficiently. Okay. We're going to be looking at a few of the stakeholder groups in a little bit more detail, and looking at some of the challenges that we've faced working in the sector around these particular stakeholder groups. And I'm going to be drawing on the expertise of sort of 3 or 4 people in the room to share, and the rest of you as well. So previously I asked if you knew what impact bonds were and understood how they worked. But can I get a show of hands, and I'm mainly looking at this side of the room because my speaker's on this side of the room, who of you are actually working on a deal, on feasibility, on investment, on... Okay. And then perhaps what you can do is just tell us who you are and who you work for and which impact bond and in what capacity.
Sure, I can start. I'm Tony McDonald. I'm the CFO of SomaSource, and we're a digital outsource provider that focuses on providing communities in developing areas jobs to do digital work for customers that are mainly based in the US and Silicon Valley. We're a nonprofit, and we've been around for 8 years, and we've survived on grant funding up until, well, we're still weaning off grant funding, but we've been working with a group in the US to do a private buyer's impact bond. It's actually a technical impact security bond. It's a little bit different from the historic structure of the security, but the objective, and we've structured the deal and we're identifying payers, but our focus is on individuals, high net worth individuals, to do the payer, and we've been very successful in identifying investors. In fact, we have more people interested in the investor side than the actual payer side. But it's part of our evolution about we're trying to get to self-sustainability, and this is the funding that we need.
And what are your outcomes, if I can ask?
So the outcomes are based on, we have a correlation between livelihood improvement based on wage increases, based on our historical data. And so what we've anchored on the outcomes is the actual amount of wages that we will ultimately deploy over the next 5 years that have a historical correlation to livelihood improvement that we've built based on our success so far. And so we're anchoring on that financial metric because it's auditable and it's very objective, and it's tied to the livelihood improvement qualitative elements in a very structured and consistent way.
Thank you.
So my name is Paul Coleman from an outfit called H2O Venture Partners. The core of H2O is about building social enterprises, and the bond work is a bit of sort of love on the side, because we are working on 2 bonds, both in infectious disease control in the tropics. By background, I'm an infectious disease person who worked in the tropics before moving into the sort of business building side. But what we've been working with DFID to build a impact bond for the control of sleeping sickness across Uganda. That work has involved social finance, and it's a great example of where both the inception work and the pre-bond sort of trial work have been funded by a donor to considerable amounts of money, of sort of around £2 million of research investment to build the bond to what would look like a sort of $30 to $50 million type bond, whose outputs and outcomes would be the mass treatment of cattle, which are the reservoir for the parasite which causes this form of sleeping sickness, and with the outcomes being reduction in disease prevalence across the country. So it's quite an ambitious bond. Very similar to you, on the investment side, there would be no problem raising that type of money from predominantly philanthropic foundations that would want to be catalytic in the space. The big constraint is the payer, and it's a great example of where you need to bring the donor, the DFI, into a outcome-based payment structure, which is proving to be a huge challenge. I mean, this is a difficult thing for donors like it in principle. DFID have put out a statement from the minister saying that it fits with the vision of the private sector being an engine for development and more efficient use of aid money, etc. But it's a big shift to bring them over to actually underwrite and agree to payments on results. The other work we're doing is on rabies control, very similar infectious disease control, but there you're using a vaccine and you've got to vaccinate a certain number of dogs within a country to reduce the transmission to humans, so similar outcome-based payments. That's working with a Gates and UBS Optimus, so I know fund some of the BERTHA. That's working with a global NGO called GARC, which is the Global Alliance for Rabies Control. And one of the target countries they're looking at is actually South Africa. It's in a very early stage. And the interesting thing there would be how the national government could contribute to that, predominantly through the commitment to allow the sustainability of the outcomes that you'd unlock through the development impact bond, so that you maintain your infectious disease reductions through the bond, how you maintain that sustainably into the future.
Yeah, we must chat about that.
Yeah.
I'm actually a veterinarian, so
Yeah.
I know a little bit about
Excellent.
rabies and how the system is working at the moment.
Yeah.
It's changing. It's changing in terms of the community health veterinary services. So,
Great.
yeah. And then you, sorry, at the back, I can't see
Hi,
your name.
I'm Vineet Menon. I'm part of the IntelliCap advisory team, and we are working on an impact bond, outcome-based payment mechanism for Shell Foundation. Even social finance is involved in it, and we're trying to develop a mechanism around access to energy finance in off-grid energy market in India, particularly focusing on small enterprises, small and medium enterprises who are involved in off-grid energy. The stage we are in is we are almost through with the feasibility, and we are yet to enter the structuring part of it. But we will be completing the feasibility now and probably starting the structuring phase.
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, well, a number of you have mentioned the difficulty with perhaps securing funding from the DFI or from your high net worths or from government. And I'd like perhaps, Barbara, if you could introduce yourself and maybe chat a little bit more about that.
Sure. We managed to get very early on the strong buy-in and support from the corporate sector, and especially the mining companies in Mozambique that had a very clear incentive and value proposition to actually play the role of outcome funder, because right now they lose a lot of money because of absenteeism of their employees not being able to be productive because of malaria. So with that, we were able to push the whole to design the full bond, but at the end haven't managed to launch it because of the negotiation with the government and the Ministry of Health, and being able to just embed this mechanism within the governance structure, because the government, because of the type of intervention it is, and the fact that the underlying interventions were also NGOs and government activities, we needed the government full approval, and didn't manage to finalize that. So since then, what we've done is we've run a pilot that was fully sponsored by the corporate sector, that we got the results last year, which were very positive. So we are going to launch corporate bond in the next months, and we are going to finalize the structuring of that in the next months.
Okay.
The other bond that we've done a few feasibility studies for large NGOs that we're looking at. Okay, we want to do a DIP. We have this whole health portfolio. Tell us what should we look at, HIV or maternal health, or what kind of segment should we focus on, and when does a DIP make sense compared to a performance-based contract or a grant, which is one of the big questions that we have in the sector. SIB is not, DIPs are not, it's not a panacea, it's not the instrument for everything, and in certain cases it does make sense, in other cases it's actually, the trade-off doesn't make sense. So that's also something that as a sector is important to bear in mind. We've been working on a few education to employment feasibility studies for DIPs in Morocco for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and as part of the compact for Morocco. We are currently working in South Africa with also an education to employment feasibility performance, pay for performance mechanism. The latest one, the last one that I want to mention is a bond that we've been working on over the last 10 months, which is a development impact bond that will fund cataract surgeries, high volume cataract surgeries in Cameroon using the Aravind social enterprise model. Excitingly, we managed to actually secure the outcome funder end of last year. So we have a $3 million commitment from the Hilton Foundation, Sightsavers, and the Fredros Foundation. So all big eye health foundations in the world, and so we are currently actually fundraising for this bond, or hoping to launch in the next 3 to 4 months. So
Nice.
that's an overview of what we've been doing, and I think just all of that learning on these lessons, for us, the cataract bond, which is the latest tip that we've been working on, we really had an approach that was really, really sequential, where okay, we focus on the outcome funder, and unless we have the outcome funder secured, then we don't do anything else. We don't engage with investors, and so that it took us 5 months to convince the Hilton Foundation has a very traditional grant giving approach of understanding why a dip would make sense for them. And in this case, for them, it's really playing a catalytic role, playing an enabler role in the sector, and being innovative. So that's really, for these kind of foundations, what makes sense. And then after that, we were okay, now we can go to market. And that was
So how we've come to DIBS specifically is, if we look at most of these contracts which we have, they're actually outcomes-based contracts to begin with. And more, we're not being paid until we deliver on those contracts and deliver on those outcomes. So we see ourselves in a way as part of what you might align similarly to an impact structure, where we're actually the working capital funder ourselves. Our approach is definitely one, I share some of Barbara's sentiments. Until we get our outcome funders lined up, and we have probably 3 or 4 pipeline DIBs waiting in different parts of the world, but we believe that we have to get that outcome funder lined up, and we're blending it with corporates, with foundations, and with local governments where possible. We're probably inching towards the 30 or late 20 odd month mark on most of them, or some of them. We've got one in India around Rajasthan maternal health. Some of you may know of that one. My colleague Peter van der Waal is working on that. We have one in PNG, which is working with vocational women groups around the resources, big LNG players there. And we have one in Ethiopia, which is not dissimilar to probably the rabies example, targeting Newcastle disease linked to chickens and women's livelihoods. We're also probably looking at something similar in Nigeria. So the way we've looked at this is, personally, and also as an organisation, we're very much encouraging collaboration around this space. My team and I pretty much are an investor, but we work with co-investors. And our sentiment is, until we can provide a robust, appropriate structure, and that's not being too focused on the current jargon or vernacular that prevails in the space, but something that's built fit for purpose, and until we can find an outcomes funder, we are very open to discussing, sharing, partnering. I mean, we're working with different parties around the room here anyway. So I'd just say that that's how we've come to the sector, and that's the view we presently have.
Well, we started reaching out to different parties like Dalberg, and when Tracy was at CDC, set up a fund, and also maybe played a role of an intermediary. But when we looked at all those factors, we decided that we would want to invest in the deal if the project is brought to us and if it fits within our sector focus. So in energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, and so forth. But I think along the lines of the projects that came to us, there was nothing that was specifically focused on what we wanted to do.
Okay.
And so those are some of the issues. Yeah. And we reached out to outcome funders like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they were very interested in it, but in terms of the way they provide funding, it's on a yearly basis. So the issue for them was, how could they participate in a development impact bond when they cannot make the payments in that specific year? So if it's a bond that's structured for 5 years, how is it going to work out for them. So those are some of the issues we face.
Some of the issues that we face.
So basically, considerations such as sector fit, geographical fit, element, and the track record. These are things where, like, what we've seen is that investors actually, it's good that it's structured as a SIP and a DIP to like capture the initial attention, but then in the end they will run their whole due diligence on the project, because like that's basically where the execution implementation risk lies. So I think we're in the middle of it, so it's a little bit like too soon to tell. There's a lot of interest, but it takes a little bit more time than what I would have anticipated, to be honest.
Okay. So if I can add to that,
Sure.
sorry. So we, as a new investor and needing co-investors, we run a very active investor mapping. So we're all talking to everybody all the time, and we're specifically running a subset of DIP investor mapping, because as somebody who's put money into impact funds before, I can tell you investor alignment is probably something that is never really spoken about, but probably the hardest and some of the fiercest conversations you can have regardless of the structure. So the sooner you start having that awareness of who your investor landscape, who it contains, I think the better.
And do you have preferred co-investors, for instance, like what?
No, because
Okay.
I think in terms of, if you look at what these structures entail, and every investor comes with their own specific criteria, I think the only thing you can try and do is really try and understand what their sweet spot is. And sometimes it can be very very specific, very bespoke, and it can actually come down to the individual in question, which makes it all that harder.
I don't know if anyone wants to add anything or ask any questions around.
But what is the focal point beyond just educating them on the structure? Because it seems so obvious that this is the right way to move, yet there's bureaucratic and whatever other challenges. But I'm wondering, based on the people that have had the experience, is there a unifying, consistent theme in getting the payer commitment or interest beyond government coordination, which I can understand as and selfishly I'm asking that to understand relative to foundations particularly, which is also in our wheelhouse. Is there something specific there that's...
For the corporates, and that's why it was like actually one of the silver lining of the Maria bond is that it's, once you've proven the economic value, like it's something that's very much easier actually to sell. And like for the Maria bond, it was a matter basically to sit with the CFO of Anglo American for 2 minutes, and he was just like, okay, I buy into it. It's like it's a no-brainer. And in context, like in South Africa, you also have like some interesting like capital structure opportunities to have the corporate sector involved. For the foundations, then it becomes more difficult and less tangible, because like you can't really make the case for economic value creation necessarily. So then it's like much more on like bringing more efficiency into the system, and playing a catalytic role, and so it's like much more intangible arguments that come into play.
If I can also add to that, just in my, and I've got relatively limited experience, is that when we've dealt with specific departments, we've very much tried to understand what their need was. So not presented them with a solution to a problem that they might not have, but really delved into what their strategy was for the next short term, medium term, and said this is how this could potentially help to go one step further in solving your problem. And then also I just wanted to mention that governments are generally resistant to any type of administrative change, and it's quite a big administrative change. Finance, supply chain management, and legal generally. So there are a lot of players that have to come in initially from each of those teams.
I would layer on programmatic is a big issue. It takes off the ones in the United States, and some things I'm working on internationally, kind of following this is, it's much easier when there's a program that, I would guess in your case, when you talk about something new and different, you're putting a huge challenge. I'm not saying that you probably don't recognize say that the government should think about this as a safe bet because they only pay if the outcomes are achieved. maybe a government official,
Yeah.
or even a foundation that wants to be on the negative side
Right.
of performance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the sad thing is, even the one deal that did have very popular, well known in New York City, well, for those who follow it, in New York City that was unwound.
Yeah.
The great thing about it is we now know why it was unwound.
Yeah.
And it's one of the great things of this tool is the transparency,
Yeah.
which again is hard to convince. And it's one of the biggest tools here is this changes the game which government has to put it out. But I would imagine again, the rabies programs and things like that are trying to get governments to do things differently than the way they've done it before. And it really gets them, it's hard, not for just for the government side, but also for the donors that are used to doing a very defined programmatic approach.
The constraint is undoubtedly the donor. The Ugandan government are completely on board. There is already an infrastructure within Rwanda which deals specifically with sleeping. And it's a, I've worked very closely with DFID over the years on this, and it is doing something different is risky for donors. And donors are all waiting, DFID is undoubtedly a bellwether within the donor world, and wait to DFID to do something, and then others will follow. And I've worked with DFID and had much more than $50 million given as a grant to control sleeping sickness, and written much quicker without probably a tenth of the due diligence of what they're doing on this, and probably because there is some return element in there, and that puts they will be held under scrutiny in the famous Daily Mail, which is a right-wing rag within the UK, which is very critical of the aid budget, and if they're seeing the aid budget giving a return on something, that requires a defence against that type of question. So I'm not privy to the internal discussions within DFID, but I'm privy to the sort of cold face and the workings of the people in there, and there's a huge amount of perceived risk of doing something different.
And yes, I think
I'm sorry to interrupt, but are we the perceived risk? But are we improperly communicating what the risk, the negative outcome will ultimately be?
Well,
Because the risk is
if you're genuinely transferring the risk in the contract to the private sector, and the failure means the private sector pay and not the government pays.
right.
There is no downside to that.
It's a negative article on a project that didn't get funded.
Completely. And you're only paying on success. So at that level, those things are communicated. You would imagine.
But that is the real issue. We're trying to get people it is about changing to performance-based management and programs that are going to have.
But again, it's just calling out that a program didn't work, but your funding didn't go through. You know what? It's the accountability level, but the financial outcome is still better.
okay.
So BERTHA Foundation, why aren't donors changing? Because development impact bonds are not going to be at all impactful unless you've got donors as the payers. It's not the role of the foundations or the corporates or the high net worth individuals. That will only be ever a tiny, tiny fraction of what impact can be delivered unless you can bring DFID, USAID, and all the others to transfer their money into the outcome payers. So what's your perception on that?
The key issue, the key feedback we get is for them to be an outcomes payer or outcomes funder, as I use, they're fine to do it, but they want to see that demonstration principle, and they want to see the commitment that we're actually creating a market here, that when they step out, government remains committed and continues to run the program. And
so the sustainability beyond the end of the bond.
How do you prove evidence when you have a change in government? How do you ensure that that's going to stay in place? That's the biggest conversation which we have with them.
And this is one of my hesitancies towards bids, which many of them have been structured by bypassing government in terms of any real involvement. It sounds like in your case that's not quite the case, but many of these have been basically the traditional donor-based program, which is we're going to give you a program and it's really cool and innovative, but we're really not engaging you to the sustainability issue. And how do you build it back into your universal health care coverage initiatives and things like that?
It is actually something that we've come across, not personally, but in the Global Fund deal, for instance. The Global Fund is like PEPFAR, and they're wanting to move out of middle income countries. So they're wanting to withdraw their donor funding from middle income countries and start focusing on kind of low income countries. And we happen to have the biggest ARV program in the world in our country, and we're going to struggle to support that program without international help. And what they have said, and what I think perhaps other donors have also said, is that they're using this outcomes-based contracting, or DIB, as a stepping stone to pulling their funding. And we're still grappling with that. We're still grappling with what that means and how this transition would actually work and how it would help. So watch this space. I think
Just a total, is anybody aware of the African legal facility or legal support facility?
No.
Right, exactly. For the most part, most people don't know. I've only recently learned about it. It's a facility intended to fund governments to do innovative financings, most often project financings around.
Can you repeat the name?
It's the African Legal Support Facilities. Tracy, does that sound right? You sound
Yeah.
like right. Is that right? Yeah. It's based. It's a secretariat out of the African Development Bank, but it's run as an independent unit. I believe its board is 3 or 4 or 5 ministers of finance across Africa. So they basically approve what types of transactions. So I'm throwing this out as I think where you're trying to head to is how do we start solving for this? It just seems that we need to start building some relationships or partners in this space that would have similar incentives to do it. So again, an entity like that, again, just using that as an example, might be one that's worth pushing to see if we can get them involved, because legal costs are tremendous here.
And even getting someone like Thomson Reuters Foundation, who have provided, I think, quite a lot of funding for the legal costs, or at least the introduced to legal firms that provide pro bono, perhaps, getting them on board with that sort of institution and seeing where the synergies lie. I don't know if, Barbara, you guys have grappled with how to reduce transaction costs. I know you've got quite a few.
Well, that's the big hairy question, I would say, in the sector, and that's something that, especially, so there's the pre-launch cost and the post-launch cost. Performance-based contracts, that's also something that comes very often in terms of what's the cost of monitoring. For a DIB, in addition to that, you have the whole setup, and given the timeline, 1 to 2 to 3 years of development cost, that's really what we're looking at and what we can. So it's basically how can we reduce this timeline and how can we develop these bonds quicker. So yeah, I guess more sharing and more as you replicate, being able to just leverage the work that has been already done in specific sectors. Right now, the problem is we're doing everything customized, and for each of the SIBs or DIBs that's being, or DIBs at least, that's being developed, we almost start from scratch. So we get to a stage where obviously we need to partner more and share more, but also at some point when more of these DIBs come out, we'll be able then to do that more efficiently. But yeah, it's we're really in this learning curve, and very much where it's a lot of investments need to be done upfront to build the sector, because everybody's getting pro bono legal fees, which is also something that the legal organizations are starting to push back very strongly on, because they're okay, great, we could do that for the first few DIBs, but we got to a stage where we need to make it a business model. We can't keep doing pro bono work for you just because it's innovative and nice and a sexy instrument. So,
and then just following up on that, this is another question. So, how do you share IP and still maintain your competitive advantage? Because this is how you guys earn a living. So you can create as many platforms as you want, but if people don't feel they're going to profit from them, then
I think it's just learning sessions like that, or having learning sessions maybe in more smaller groups, and being able to just acknowledge that and do that. I think there have been some attempts to do that. I think people talk. I think so people talk about the lessons learned and what needs to be done, but don't necessarily are not willing to exchange the documents and all that. So that's where it becomes the IP becomes difficult to share. But I don't have an easy answer to that, to be honest.
Well, it sounds to me like the more deals are done, the more everybody
Yeah.
So not necessarily. The documentation, as Tracy said, has not been very, am I using a polite word here, has not been very well disclosed. As a matter of fact, we almost didn't close the broker transaction, the juvenile justice, because there was pressure to not release the documents. And as the board, we refused at the 24th last minute to say we wouldn't close the deal. And since we had the last dollars going in, it made the difference.
Yeah, I'm
And so I think there is still a hesitancy. I was just going to I think on Monday, Brookings will be doing a readout of their most recent paper on early childhood and use of impact financings. And I think they have an interest as themselves to be some type of knowledge center. I think we do need to start just pushing that. That is, again, a donor-driven, because it's going to take grant monies to support something like that. But I do think we need some type of common knowledge. We are going to get, there is a competitive landscape at the moment, but I think if you go way back when the banks used to all compete for each other for loans in the same, big corporate steps, they finally realized that if they started sharing documentation, sharing deals, that they could actually increase the deal flow. Right. And I think we're not there quite yet. One, because, as you say, the difference of the world is still hesitant to push forward. So there is all of this kind of who's going to step forward first. But I think it is up to the sector. And the more I listen to this conversation, I think there's a need to have an African-based or at least some type of internationally based kind of, it's a consortium, working group, or nonprofit-focused sharing of knowledge.
And this is probably moving a few steps ahead, but do you think it would be more helpful if those knowledge centres were sector-specific, or do you think it would be helpful to have a DIB-specific knowledge centre or an outcomes-based contracting centre? Or will it just happen organically, depending on who's driving it? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you very much, Drew and Tracy and Barbara and Fode, for contributing your experience. Really very interesting. I learned a heck of a lot. And if anyone wants to chat further about this, please come and find me. I'm around for the rest of the afternoon.